Welcome to Des Talks, Design Exhibition Scotland's lively exploration of making and creating. I'm Susanna Beaumont, and I look forward to sharing with you insightful and inspiring conversations with some of our most adventurous, curious and brilliant designers, artists, makers and curators. We talk ideas and inspiration, challenges, ambitions and the joy of creativity. I'm delighted today to be talking about the exhibition Thread Memory, Embroidery from Palestine, which is currently on at V&A Dundee. To discuss the exhibition, I'm joined by its curator, Rachel Dedman, a writer, art historian, and since 2019, the Jameel Curator of Contemporary Art from the Middle East at V&A London, along with two contemporary practitioners whose work features in Thread Memory, Haidar, a London-based Lebanese artist, and Leena Nammari, a Palestinian artist and printmaker based in Edinburgh. I very much hope you enjoy this episode of Des Talks. When I walked into the galleries at V&A Dundee, I was overwhelmed by colour, intricacy and beauty. You're greeted by an array of women's long-sleeved robes, mainly from the 19th and 20th century, all fiery reds and oranges, often stitched onto dark coloured cotton, then stripes in yellow and green, the detail, the decorative, all marking time and memory in thread and celebrating the skilled movement of hands and fingers. There is power in these robes, embroidered and stitched by Palestinian women for Palestinian women. This is tatreez, the ancient practice of hand embroidery. And Rachel, I would just like to invite you to just tell us a little bit more about Thread Memory.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, first of all, for having us, Susanna. It's a pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about the exhibition. I mean, maybe I can start with a quick definition of tatreez and Palestinian itself for those who haven't seen the show yet or aren't familiar with the material. I mean, tatreez the word means embroidery in Arabic, but in the Palestinian context, the term has come to refer to a much greater set of cultural practices and rich heritage traditions around women's clothing and dress, exactly as you described. And at its core is the act of embroidery. You know, it's such a simple, humble thing, the repetitive binding of thread to fabric. It's really an ancient craft that has been practiced all over the world for centuries. And in Palestine, it has these really ancient roots characterized by that spectacular beauty, as you said, lots of wonderful colour, typically reds and oranges and pinks, magentas against sort of deep indigo dyed linen and cotton. But it's often difficult to give a physical description. Yours was lovely. When you go into the show, you're really met by this forest of historical dresses that mostly come from that 19th or early 20th century, which is what we consider the heyday of tatreez, and it's when we have most surviving examples of tatreez. By then, embroidery displayed this extraordinary regional diversity. Every area of Palestine, down indeed to neighbouring villages, had their own approach to the cut and the colour and the textiles of their garments, their own sort of forms and designs of the motifs that they were using, their own particular headdresses, their own approach to jewellery. So there was this extraordinary wealth and diversity in women's dress. And it operated in that sense really as much more than embellishment, something that was decorative on the body. It worked truly as a language.
And these places like Nablus, Gaza, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, I suppose if you were a woman there, you could identify another woman by the stitches, the colours of the cloth from where she came from, but also the narrative. Would you say there was a narrative in this stitching?
Yes, I'd say not necessarily in a very literal way, but absolutely. Written into women's garments were her life, you know, the expression of her identity. You could read in the hem of someone's clothing, at the hem of a thobe or a dress, which village she was from. You could tell from the detail on a bracelet whether she was breastfeeding. You could see in the use of blue thread, perhaps, whether she was in mourning or stricken by grief. In the style of her designs or the motifs, you know, women from Jaffa were often involved. Their families were in the citrus growing industry, so you see the orange blossom motif. In Mejdel or Gaza, lots of families were involved in weaving, so you see sort of beams and combs and scissor motifs that are connected to that industry. So absolutely, written into women's clothing in a way that isn't always literal is this sort of rich and complex sense of who she was, both her kind of identity, status and origins, and something of her emotional and personal life.
And as you said, there's one outfit where you can see it's been cut away for when she was breastfeeding or when maybe the dress was passed on to another woman. So there's kind of evolutions marking a woman's life. And as you say, and I didn't realise it was blue embroidery that marks grief.
Yes, I mean, blue is a colour that's used also for youth. It's not uniquely the colour of grief. And you find indigo-dyed linen and cotton as very common base fabrics for tatreez across Palestine and isn't connected to grief necessarily. But particularly in the Bedouin context, it has this association, and women who had maybe lost a husband or were no longer married would use blue on their as part of their tatreez to express that period of mourning. And it's so incredible to me because, as anyone who's ever embroidered will know, as Leena and Aya especially will know, tatreez takes a very, very long time. Any embroidery takes a long time. So in taking this blue thread and putting aside those bright colours and stitching with just blue, you're marking the days of your grief. You're living through grief. And in fact, the very first dress in the exhibition, the first object, is a grief dress from Bir al-Sabah, from in the south of Palestine. And I wanted to start with this because we're living through genocide. We're witnessing genocide. And I wanted to set the tone of the exhibition from the beginning by saying, the tone is grief. We're all in grief at this moment. But there's hope there too. There's a tiny little motif in pink or sort of red that's been added again to the skirt. And women would do this to kind of indicate that they were maybe ready for remarriage or to re-enter the world a different way.
I mean, perhaps it would be great to talk now about how the thread memory came about. It's a collaboration with Art Jameel and the Palestinian Museum, and most of the beautiful garments are drawn from the V&A collection and the Palestine Museum. I know you've worked in the Middle East, in Lebanon. You spent time in Palestine. How did the exhibition come into being?
I've been working on this subject for, more than 12 years now. And it started because, as you say, I was an independent curator based in Lebanon for 6 or 7 years before I joined the V&A. And quite a lot of that time was spent working for the Palestinian Museum, which is in Exquisite in the West Bank, not far from Ramallah. And I started working for them even before they opened, developing a kind of satellite exhibition on tatreez and the history of Palestinian dress in Beirut. And that evolved into a much bigger show in their kind of flagship site, a show with contemporary artists working with embroidery. So that it started really this love for tatreez for me and this deep connection with these histories, which evolved then over time and has kind of never stopped. The books and the exhibitions that we made in the Middle East sort of ended up evolving into a project that came to the UK in 2023-24 at Kettle's Yard and the Whitworth in Cambridge and Manchester, which was called Material Power, Palestinian Embroidery. And that show then itself it became the catalyst for thread memory, which started in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia at Jameel earlier this year in January, and then moved to V&A Dundee, which was, I think, a lovely sort of next chapter for the project because it allowed us to expand and add V&A material to the collection, although the majority is the Palestinian Museum collection. I've had this very long relationship with the Palestinian Museum, so it's lovely to be able to work with them again.
And what we should say, of course, that Dundee is twinned with Nablus since 1980. So as much as there's all these amazing works, there's very much the local, and there's photographs of the signing between the Dundee councillors and the mayor from Nablus, and these photographs from the 80s. And what I found incredibly poignant was the former First Minister of Scotland, Hamza Yousaf's wife's, her outfit, Nadia El Nakla's outfit in garment and robe, which was beautiful. So what is wonderful about the exhibit, it weaves in the kind of international, the Palestinian, but also the very much the local and those ties between Dundee and Nablus.
Exactly. No, absolutely. Every time I do an exhibition, it's really about transforming it and connecting it to that local context. So in Saudi, we borrowed from local Palestinian diaspora families who had their own dress there. And in Dundee, we knew from the start that the twinning was a big part of the story. And we could borrow from the Dundee Nablus Twinning Association and their archives and celebrate this remarkable feat of Bassem Shaka, the mayor of Nablus in 1980, and that connection to Dundee, which has been so important and beautiful, an act of solidarity. And then to extend it into the present and think about the ways in which Scottish solidarity with Palestine more broadly has been reflected in clothing, in design, in dress, in Nadia's incredible thobe. I mean, Nadia, we should say, she's a councillor for Dundee, extremely active and has been a huge supporter of the exhibition. And when she wore the thobe that you mentioned, it's this beautiful sort of modern version of a Palestinian tatriz thobe. She wore it to the opening of Parliament, or this important moment when her husband, Hamza Yousaf, indeed, was First Minister. And I think she wore it as a moment of pride, of course. She didn't expect it to go viral. And I remember seeing that moment, it was some years ago, without a sense that we would be doing the exhibition. So then to be able to work with her, to have her very kindly lend us the dress and have it resonate with so many local visitors has been truly an incredible dream come true, really. It's such a special moment of Tatri's power in the present, right? The continued power of dress, of representation, of embroidery as solidarity. And that's really what the exhibition is about. It's sort of about immersing a visitor in the heyday of this tradition and helping people be able to read embroidery, but also to understand it as resistance and solidarity, an act of radical politics in the present, something that has been politicized over time and taken on all of these new and important meanings.
I mean, that's what I felt was so powerful and poignant, is the bringing together both of the historic and the contemporary, and stitching as power and politic, the personal, and there can be the subversive. And for Aya, who came over from Lebanon, I think you were quite a young child when your family settled in London, but not so long ago you did a residency up at Devon Arts up in Huntly, which is in Aberdeenshire, so kind of north of Edinburgh. I think from your studies, you studied at the Slade, then you were...
I went to Slade and then LSE.
LSE. And for you, working as an artist, it is about women, it's about power, it's about community, it's about conversation, it's about that sense of stitching, and how sometimes when you're doing something like stitching, you can reveal carefully, slowly, grief, turmoil, tragic loss. So can you talk about your time maybe in Huntly, which is a small town in Aberdeenshire, and that time, and working with Syrian refugees?
Yeah, so on this residency, I was invited up as a creative practitioner, as an artist, alongside an anthropologist to try and integrate 120 Syrian refugees into this tiny little town. It was back in 2018, so it was at like the height of all these Syrian refugees kind of crossing the sea and crossing Europe. And, the national headlines were referring to them as cockroaches and dehumanizing them in the worst way, as they still are, actually, as they still are to a lot of migrants. And so I went up there with my two young kids, not really knowing what to expect, but I just kind of went up there thinking it will be something that I'm sure I will learn from in some shape or form. And I was the first Arab speaker to come into contact with them in over 2 years. They had one person from the council, but they had nobody else. And so as it happens, the project it became about food, because we looked at the data and we realized that the Syrian community and the local Scottish community didn't assimilate. They kind of sat side by side. And so a way in which you can bridge two communities is through food, and food is incredibly political. Understanding, you don't have to physically talk about where you left. You can actually taste, if you taste someone's food and if you share your last bite with someone, then you understand generosity and you understand that wealth of culture and heritage is in that bite. And so they didn't actually have to exchange words. They just sat side by side and shared food, and their children played together. And so that was really what I was there for. But in those conversations, because I was the only Arab speaker and I looked like them, we had the same religion, ethnically we were the same, came from the same part of the world, our kids looked the same, and they played together. I sat with them and they kind of, they took me in as their own. And so many conversations arose from peeling potatoes and chopping onions and all of that, the labor of our hands, making, cooking. We spoke, and so many stories surfaced of their journeys crossing Europe and the homes that they left behind and the real absolute like harrowing traumas that they experienced.
And is this how the piece that is on show at V&A Dundee, which is this kind of installation of suspended plastic bags with the names of the shops, a place, maybe a bit of graphics, and they're there kind of ghostly, empty, suspended, and it's very beautiful but very throwaway. But when you draw near to it, you realise that you have stitched. So you're telling the story of refugees, women predominantly fleeing with small children, with a few things they've managed to kind of literally gather within maybe minutes. Did that come out of these conversations while peeling potatoes and chopping onions?
Yeah, I think one thing about this work was how a lot of my work kind of comes from conversation or like a little aha moment. I don't go in researching and thinking, oh, I'm going to go find out. It actually came from me going to one of the women's houses and she was going to make me falafel and she had a falafel scoop on the table that looked completely bashed up. Like, and we were in the middle of nowhere. Like there was no way you could buy a falafel scoop in rural Aberdeenshire. Like there's no way. And so I asked her, where did you get this from? And she said to me, oh, that's one of the things that I escaped with, I took with me. And I was like, you know, like the forces are coming after you, you're running for your life and you chose to take a falafel scoop. Why? And she just said, because I was running with my 5 kids and I needed to ensure that I could feed them. And she said that I had to chuck it in my handbag and we left. I couldn't pack a suitcase. I didn't have the luxury of time or the safety of having a big suitcase because then it would alert the forces that we were fleeing. And so it sparked a real curiosity for me in that moment of thinking, if we were to leave now, what would I take? What were the essentials? I was with my 2 young kids. Would I be practical and take nappies and formula, or would I take my papers and money? Would I take my passport? Like, what would I take? And so I opened up the conversation around the community and asked them, what would they take? What did they take? And so it led to me embroidering onto these plastic bags that like typical plastic bags that they would have escaped with, all the items that they took with them. And what I hope it does is creates arenas of discussion around these questions, because these are questions that far too many people wouldn't even consider, because it's just not a reality in our world. It's a luxury that we rely on, of like stability and peace, but for a lot of people in the world that is not the case. And also just to kind of gently humanize a situation where when you look at a bag and you think, God, a mother took period pads and nappies, or a father took his reading glasses and his medicine, or, you know, things like that, that make you actually question your own privilege, you know, in looking at this.
Because you list, I mean, that's what makes it so moving, because in the caption you list, you know, socks, blood pressure pills, school books, nappies, prayer mats, photographs. So it is incredibly powerful, the emptiness of the bag, but knowing what was put in there, as you say, with speed, fear, anxiety, the gathering of children, the gathering of a little bit of food. And when we were chatting last week, I couldn't quite remember, but now I have the Ursula K. Le Guin 1984 essay, the Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which is a brilliant read, and we'll put it in the kind of information at the end of the podcast. But it talks about the vessel, whether it's a bag or clay vessel for transporting water or oil, or a bag for belongings that are women, and how these are the unspoken narrative. Often it's not about war, you know, axe handles and sharp implements. It's about women carrying, whether they're carrying a child or carrying belongings. So I think the work resonated so kind of powerfully. And your stitching, where did you decide to stitch? Because again, you're taking the hand and that stitching marking time kind of, and as you stitch, you think. So I found that incredibly powerful to see your addition of stitching.
I mean, for me, it's my language. It's the way I've always been. My grandmother taught me how to stitch, and it was a way in which she told me stories and taught me about my heritage and where we came from through stitching. So our hands were always busy as we spoke. So that act of making and speaking and sharing, it's part of my fiber. And so, yeah, it's my visual language. And there is that element, like that durational element that's slow and thoughtful. And, you know, these stories, they're heavy, and you have to take your time with it. It's very different to just drawing them or painting them or whatever, sketching them. It's so slow and delicate, you know, piercing through plastic bags, and how you manage that there's a delicacy there that it almost feels like you're physically honoring this very, very delicate story. You know, you're holding someone's deepest, heaviest, you know, burdens, and presenting them in an installation that hopefully talks about a greater issue, you know?
I mean, it's beautiful to hear Aya talk about your work, but also sort of that you learned to stitch from your grandmother. This is something that has been true for Palestinian girls and women throughout time. It's about embroidery and tatreez. It's about the handing down of female knowledge. And for me as a curator, it's always really important for that reason to include contemporary artists like you, like Leena, in the show. And in the case of Thread Memory, contemporary fashion designers as well, to understand tatreez not as something that's stuck in amber or purely confined to the past, but rather this active living tradition that is being pushed and evolved in different ways. And I think stitch work sometimes, or in the past, has been seen or dismissed as women's work or something that's marginal for that reason, from being so gendered. And the exhibition, in its both historical and contemporary things, I hope, or I'm sure I know, speaks to that being its superpower, right? As a vessel, a form for female knowledge and storytelling and bearing witness. And I love that Aya and Leena's work is there among these historical objects, and making this point that stitching continues to be, the use of tatreez as a legacy continues to be this powerful, critical medium for artists in the present.
Totally. And I think it's palpable, that power, the politics and the kind of grief, but the moments of joy. But I think we move on to Leena now. And Leena studied printmaking at Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design in Dundee. But your work, Absence Does Not Mean Forgetting, is actually a different medium. It's 626 porcelain paper clay tablets, which are hung in serried ranks. And again, I think it's the silence of it that speaks volumes. Can you tell me a little bit about it? And it's the colour. It's cypress trees in red, which is an incredibly powerful motif within Palestine, on white. Can you just say a little bit how it looks and how it came about?
Sure. I'm a printmaker, as you mentioned. So everything I think about is in printmaking terms. And so everything I have to do in a way has to be quite flat. So this is one of the reasons I've actually made some flat pieces. And the embroidery itself, I actually was, because it's something that we do all the time when you're busy or not busy. So you either stitch, you knit, or you embroider. So this is the embroidery that I made. It's a 3 trees, and the motif at the bottom is the walls of Jerusalem. I was trying to make a new narrative with tatreez. And I was trying to do it without having the waste canvas. I was trying to do it freehand. Disaster. So I had to make it quite large. I was trying to print it. I was trying to make an embossment out of it. And I was sharing a studio with a friend who is a ceramicist. And she was just like, why don't you try and print it onto clay? And she brought out some paper clay, some paper porcelain, which has paper embedded within it. So therefore it felt printmaking to me. And you can make it very thin and it holds its shape more easily than pure clay, whether it's porcelain or terracotta or stoneware. So having the paper in it kind of gives it kind of body. So I basically made really flat bits and I pressed the embroidery into it, cut them out, fired them, and then colored them in red. Now, it's quite actually hard to get a red color in glaze, so I had to mix up my own. And the red comes from the tatreez that you find around Palestinian dresses in general, but in particular in Ramallah. I grew up in Ramallah. Even though I am from Jerusalem, my name is Leena Nammari. I'm from Jerusalem. My name Nammari means Jerusalem. You can't be from anywhere else. So if you have a Nammari in Saudi, they're still from Jerusalem. If you have a Nammari in Amman, they're from Jerusalem. Full stop. We've got family Nammaris all over the world, but they are from Jerusalem, full stop. We have family documents and various kind of research. We have been in Jerusalem documented since the 11th century in Jerusalem, in the old city. So we are from Jerusalem. But I grew up in Ramallah and I'm actually wearing my school top.
Yes, I love that.
Which is really cool. It says Madaris al-Friends, which means the Friends School. I went to a Quaker school in Ramallah. It was brilliant. We learned tatreez in school. But because I grew up in Ramallah, I got very used to the Ramallah dresses, and I was part of a debke team when I was in school.
And the Ramallah dresses, aren't they often the cream with the red? So
they tend to be cream and red. And there are very specific motifs on Ramallah dresses that you can identify immediately. The tall palms, are absolutely Ramallah. There's a cauliflower motif. It is absolutely Ramallah. And there's a certain kind of star shape called the Moon of Ramallah or the Moon of Bethlehem, which is a very similar thing. You immediately identify them as Ramallah. And to me, it just made sense.
The leech. I always think
the leech is fabulous, which is kind of like an S-shaped motif. And that is very Ramallah. So there are certain motifs that you can identify. And even though I am not a Ramallahite, I love Ramallah. We were just talking before the recording started with Aya, just like Ramallah has a little bubble of calm. It's got good air. The people in the past used to go and take the air in the summer because it was cool, and it's got trees and it's bucolic. It always had that kind of feeling of relaxed. Even though now it's the center of government and there's a lot of issues, Ramallah still has kind of a draw to it, more so than many of them. And they've called it kind of like the poor man's Beirut. There's always kind of a little party going on. Ramallah is really, I love Ramallah. I try and get there every time I go home. So that's kind of how the plaques started out.
What I think was the size of them, as if they were keys that you would be having.
Well, it's transportable. It's
exactly.
It's something that kind of going back to what Aya's kind of work is about is what would you take, and what would you take if you had to run, and this is the thing that's always in every Palestinian's head. What would you take? I mean, it was discussions that we always had, even when I was in school, and since then, I know exactly what I would take. I would take my passport and run. That is absolutely the first thing. I need to have an identity. I need to have proof.
But what's so, going back to this piece, which I found is that clay tablets, they resonate through history, kind of biblical times with the passing of commandments. But also there's something about clay that before it's fired, it's very solid and clay-like, and then it's fired and it becomes incredibly brittle. So in a way, it has a permanence, but it's much more fragile. And there's something about these that the way they're just pinned onto the wall and the fear that they will drop. And of course, each one represents a habitation, a town, a settlement that has been taken over. So the poignance of these pieces, they represent a grief, a memorial to evacuation and death.
Well, the motif itself is a cypress tree, and the cypress tree represents, to me, ubiquitous form of, it's a motif that's found on all Palestinian dresses, just about different shapes. You can always recognize the cypress tree. They're either kind of triangular or they've got little fronds coming out of it. Some of them have got little crosses on the top and the bottom to say that this is a Christian town. Ramallah has a little cross on it. Bethlehem's got a little cross on it. Parts of Jaffa have got little crosses on it to say that this person was a Christian by the way they were dressed. And so the cypress tree is a motif that's ubiquitous throughout Palestinian dresses. So I thought that would represent a village. And that's why I actually used that. And each clay tablet is quite unique. Even though they come from the same pattern, each one has been hand pressed. So they are the same, but they're all different. And the 627 villages now, they've disappeared off the map. But doesn't mean that we've forgotten them. And that's kind of the whole point of it, and that's why it's called Absence Does Not Mean Forgetting, because Palestinians remember their history. And the only way we can remember it is by talking about it and by presenting it. And even though the places don't exist, the fragility of those clay tablets, that means they will exist. And the reason I've made them out of clay is that though they are extremely fragile, they will last forever. Because once you have fired clay, it is vitrified. It is like lava. It is not going to go anywhere. So if you find a piece of porcelain in 1,000 years' time, it'll still be a piece of porcelain. And that's kind of the point of it, kind of thing, for it to be permanent and yet ridiculously fragile. So they can break, but that's okay. There's also a thing in Palestinian and Arabic culture, Levantine culture, if something breaks, that means that there was an evil eye in the area. So the evil has been broken. So it's okay. You can break something. It's no big deal. The evil has been removed. And I installed those pieces with map pins and I hammered each one and I broke a few while I was hammering them on the wall because the walls were quite hard. But that's all part of the process, that's fine. That's okay.
But that, again, Rachel, it seems really important to you that you kind of bring in the contemporary practitioners like Aya and Leena to talk about the present of what is happening, the politics, because the politics of making, which is kind of ever thus, and particularly I think in craft, and we think craft is activism for women and often allowing kind of a space to maybe verbalise and share ideas that can then kind of travel on into the world. What do you feel this exhibition is celebrating? It's women, it's Palestine, but it's the art of craft. And as both Aya and Leena have said, they've learnt stitching or tatreez at school from the grandmother, this idea of kind of heritage, but then taking it through to the contemporary.
I think it's a love song to Palestine. That's how I think of it. Love song to Palestinian women. We're living, as we said, through horrific times. In Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, all over the region, no more so intensely than in Gaza. And being constantly confronted with that, having to witness it at a distance is extremely difficult. Obviously, not a patch on living through it. But I wanted the exhibition to be a place where we also celebrate Palestinian joy, where you can come and be immersed in, as you say, women's creativity and beauty and intricacy and complexity. I think the word sort of dehumanized has come up a lot in this conversation. And it's so true that Palestine is a place and the Palestinian people are a people who have been so relentlessly dehumanized since the late 19th century onwards. Today, by the media, by geopolitical powers, by Israel, by Zionism. There's this relentless dehumanization of this community. And what's so powerful about clothing, about fashion, about art, is that it has this familiarity. We all have relationship to dress. We all put clothing on our bodies every day. And tatreez, as I think has become clear as we've all been talking, tells stories, holds stories. And so by celebrating tatreez and fashion and clothing, women, you can unfold this human history of place. And what I hope and I know is happening is that audiences are coming in their droves and convening in a way with these pieces, learning someone's name. Even in all the archival imagery that washes the show, there's so much in there, photography and some film that I commissioned from an artist, Maeve Brennan, some years ago. Interviews with Palestinian women in Lebanon, Palestine and Jordan who continue to embroider today, telling their stories, giving their sense of it. We have their names on the wall. The archival imagery all comes from the Palestinian Museum's extraordinary digital archive, which comes really from Palestinians' individual, personal photographic collections. Thousands of Palestinian families gave the museum their images for digitization and then sort of had the originals returned to them. And it's amazing what a difference this makes. You're not just looking at colonial images of anonymized subjects, but really at people's family portraits, their family photos, their snaps, and you can learn their names. And that, I think, is so powerful, to come away knowing something about a Palestinian woman, her family, her history, her story is really the point of it all, I think.
Just wanted to add to that. What's so important about the show is that it's reclaiming a narrative. It's allowing Palestinians and Palestinian histories and stories to be shared in a way where Palestine is not about rubble and conflict and war and sadness and tragedy. Actually, it's about pride and it's about heritage and history and storytelling and richness, wealth. Showing the world that actually this is legacy of Palestine and the region. It's not about this contemporary story that the world wants to tell about Palestine. It's more than that. It's about putting a face to what Palestine is. It's about women, actually, the strength of women. Women are the main story here. They're not these second-rate members in society that are voiceless and, as told by Western media, that they're dominated by the patriarchy. Actually, no. Resistance is happening at the hands of the women. And one of the lines that I love in Maeve Brennan's films, and I quote it, and it says, "Men fight with the sword and women fight with the needle." And that is my absolute favorite quote, and that the resistance is absolutely held in the hands of women. And so what Rachel has beautifully curated in this show is that she's projected women's voices in the resistance of Palestine and how the legacy is held by women. The history, the culture is preserved by women. And that is something really important for me as a takeaway in this show.
She's called Maryam Abu Laban, the woman who said that. We met her in Namma. She's amazing.
That's brilliant. And I think, as you say, as we all say, that you kind of walk into those rooms at V&A Dundee and it's a celebration of the hand, I think, of stitching, of time, of marking time, community of women, voices. And I think actually, if you listen here, you can hear those voices. And I think that's why the Maeve Brennan films are so good, because you can hear the chatter of women.
Maeve's films are so important because typically it's mainly men that go and make films, and they're not allowed into women's spaces, specifically Arab women or Bedouin women. And so we don't know anything about the histories of women and tatriz and craft and women in their tents or in their homes. And so for Maeve to be able to infiltrate that and actually see women who are relaxed and chatting, and that chatter of women, that's how our histories are preserved, and they're shared with our children because our children play at our feet. And so that's kept alive. And so there's this beautiful insight into something that otherwise is undocumented. So I think Maeve's films are so important for that reason.
No, I totally agree. Thank you so much to Leena, Aya and Rachel. And we'll put all the details of the exhibition dates, but it runs till April next year. But thank you so much for sharing so powerfully your stories and your love and delight in tatriz, stitching, celebration of women. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thread Memory, Embroidery from Palestine is made in partnership with Art Jameel, the Palestinian Museum, V&A South Kensington and V&A Dundee. It's on at V&A Dundee until the 26th of April 2026. Thank you so much for listening to Des Talks. Please do spread the word, share, subscribe, rate and rave. We really want to reach as many people as possible, far and wide. And don't forget to explore our previous podcasts, such as our conversation with ceramic artist Francis Priest, jewellery maker and stone collector Stephanie Chong, and potter Cara Guthrie. And huge thanks to musician Malin Lewis for cycle lane, which accompanies Des Talks, and Ryan Scott Film for production.